So you want to make games, but you realize that, hey, maybe making a 2D platformer or making a puzzle game, whilst easy, isn't always the best approach if you want to actually get other people to pay money for your game on platforms like Steam, for example. And then the question, of course, I mean, it's one of our most popular videos, is what genre should I make for like my game? What should my first game be? What is a genre that is kind of a good mix of not too hard and something that you can do in a reasonable time frame, not a 7-year RPG, but is also something that other people could be interested in actually playing and, more importantly, paying for. These are some of my suggestions. I have some broad general genres I suggest. And I also have some more specific ones if you're, for example, a programmer or an artist, where you can lean more into that unfair advantage that you have or that affinity with certain pieces of game development. I think let's start with the blanket one. If you are brand new to game development, one of the easiest games to get started with, and it's something that a lot of people talk about and you see it as well, is horror games. Sure, a lot of horror games get made on Steam as well. I fully hear you, but if we look at that balance of what is good to make, what is something that people don't mind generally to throw a few bucks at, and is something that also isn't really the most complicated in terms of mechanics, in terms of like getting the entire game, your art, your visuals and whatever. I think horror is a really strong contender, and it is a genre that anyone can make, really. And I think what you hear here as well, and it's something that we have said ourselves even, because we've considered making horror games at certain points as well, is, oh, but I am super scared of horror movies and whatever. I have zero tolerance for horror, basically. But that isn't really something that should stop you too much. It's something when I've talked to horror game devs as well, where they say, yeah, you don't actually need to be a super horror buff, because then you don't always know entirely anymore what is truly scary and what is just like something that you are desensitized to, and you don't really know what is something that average players may be scared of. So don't be scared of that. Anyone can like make horror games, and it's kind of, well, easy. I mean, easy is a big word, but out of all the genres, if you have no experience, for example, with art, there are a lot of easy approaches. Either you can go for what is currently kind of having a bit of a resurgence, is that PS1's era, like very, very low poly 3D, and then you put like a CRT filter on it, or something that is super easy as well, thanks to things like mega scans and all of the asset packs on, for example, Unreal, is those very realistic looking games. And there's frameworks and everything that allow you to do a lot of the offloading of, hey, writing custom inventories, writing custom controllers and whatever. You just have to focus on, okay, what is my environment gonna be? What is my story going to be, for how much that may matter? And what are the vibes that I wanna give? Are you someone who is cleaning up graveyards in the middle of the night? Are you in an abandoned asylum? Whatever. There is so many ways that you can do horror, and it's something that you can get into pretty easily with just a few asset packs and whatever engine you want, really. Any engine supports making horror games, basically. I do suggest going for 3D instead of 2D. 2D horror is a bit harder to pull off. It's definitely something you can do, but it's not as easy, I would say. And I think horror also allows for a certain level of jank. We see that with B-grade horror movies, for example, where, you know, it's kind of shitty, but it still scares us. And it's similar to horror games where, you know, it doesn't need to be super polished. If the monster decides to bug out, well, that's part of the experience now. There is definitely a lower amount of polish required for horror games compared to strategy games or compared to any other game, really. I would still suggest, of course, do your best. Don't just shit out horror asset flips. Try and add some original stuff. And my main piece of advice as well, if you do want to make horror games, because I've played a whole bunch of your guys' horror games as well, is to focus on sound design. This is my little tip for you. It's actually whatever visual style you take or whatever, focus on getting the sound nailed as fast as possible, because horror games is very much vibes based, and sound is one of the most crucial things for creating the vibes of your game. So if you can put some effort into that very early on, it's going to help you a lot down the line in determining, hey, is this actually a spooky game, yes or no? Now, a lot of you guys come in with some prior experience. Either you're an artist who wants to transition into game development, or you're like a full-time software engineer who kind of is burned out on software as a service applications and just wants to make games. There are some benefits that you have depending on your background. If you are someone who's really good at programming, this can be kind of tricky because this is a genre that can go super deep. I would suggest going for things like strategy games. That is also the transition we did. Our team of Bite Me here consisted of software engineers, like programmers. We hadn't touched games before, really. So what is something that is a good game fit for us? Strategy games, because those are, at the end of the day, web applications or like boring business applications where you simulate a factory or whatever, but it has a fancy 3D front end. That is honestly the easiest way I can describe it. Unity is just another front end for another business application, except this time it's fun and it's not something boring. You can decide what it is and you just have to make it a little bit more fancy, but you don't have to go usually for custom bespoke art because it's going to be the mechanics that carry your game most of the time. If you have something that's a good mechanical loop, like an automation game, for example, we didn't nail that one fully, but we had the right mindset, I think, looking back at Forge Industry. That is something that you can go a long way with. It is something where you can create games that you don't need to write a big, long narrative. You don't need to do crazy amounts of level design, because those are things that you probably aren't talented in. You are good at hunkering down and writing out code. And if that's the case, strategy games are a good balance of having a pretty high demand on general on Steam for management games, factory games, city builders, colony sims, whatever. And it's something that gives a lot of playtime with not as much development time. Like making a 20-hour game that is a strategy game is going to take less time than making a 20-hour linear game, for example, because you can reuse a lot of more content and you can make a more fun gameplay loop. It's not going to be easy. Nothing of these genres at the end of the day is going to be easy, but it is going to be something that I think you can lean into more, and it's going to feel more familiar to make that transition from software development into game development. Now, if you're going the other way, if you're going from an art perspective and you're going into regular game development, what I would suggest for you to make then is a roguelite. I know there's so many roguelites on Steam. I mean, there's everything is so much on Steam. I've made videos about oversaturation before. Roguelites, and like specifically like things like, for example, action roguelites, where, you know, you are a character and it's like maybe a survivor-like. You have a lot of replayability from the go with that entire roguelike aspect and that meta progression. And what you then need to focus on is making stunning art and getting a really cool setting for your game. And that is more important with those games than the exact items and the exact upgrades you're going to have in your roguelite games, for example. Having a unique setting, having a unique hook. Visuals are more important on Steam, honestly, than mechanics. I think if you're an artist going into game development, you have much more of an advantage than if you're a programmer going into game development. And I know as an artist, you may be cursing and like hating code. If you can make good art, you're going to be able to stand out much more easily on Steam compared to a programmer who's using asset packs and maybe he has 20 hours of gameplay in his game, but it's not always as easy to convey that depth versus I have custom bespoke art on my Steam page and whatever, and that is going to sell the game a lot more at the end of the day. Now, I already briefly touched upon it at the beginning of the video, but I quickly want to cover some of the trap genres as well. These are genres that are extremely easy to make or relatively easy to make. The problem is those have kind of truly reached points of saturation on Steam to a certain degree. We're looking at 2D platformers, for example. Sure, every Godot tutorial is a 2D platformer basically, but there's not really that much anymore that we can do with 2D platformers. You really need to figure out something special, and that's something that if these are your first games making and you're watching these videos, you probably don't have that in you yet. I'm gonna be honest, to really stand out, to become the next Celeste or Hollow Knight or whatever. Those are not things that you can make as your first game. I have to be honest there. Other genres, for example, is like puzzle games. Like you have those cute games of like, oh, find the 100 hidden cats. But that is once again something that you are probably not going to be very competitive in. Those games sell for $1 tops, whatever. And getting those marketed is really hard. Idlers is another one, point and click games. Those are generally the games that I would suggest you to avoid making, even though they are easy. And you can make them if you want, but I wouldn't focus on Steam releasing them. You can make them to learn your engine, but I think you shouldn't go in there being the idea of, hey, this is gonna be my Stardew Valley, this is gonna be the game that's gonna make me $17 gazillion. That's not gonna happen. You can use them as learning if you want, but I don't think you should try and sell those because it's really hard. Visual novels is another one of those where, you know, you have engines like RenPy, but first of all, are you a really good writer? Maybe, probably not. And even if you are, maybe it's better off to just write a book, honestly. Like you need to have a really good combination of art and writing skills to create genres like visual novels as well. They may seem super easy. I could probably make an AI slop novel as well using like Midjourney to generate images and then write my own story, or hell, worse, let ChatGPT write a story. and almost automatically shit out those games on Steam. Once again, very high competition. Unless you're doing NSFW stuff, it's not really worth it as well either. And then on the other scale of the spectrum, because those games are kind of near impossible to sell and to market and to get people interested in, is the open world early access survivor games. Those are generally one of the top 3 selling genres on Steam most of the time. The problem is these are not beginner friendly games, I think. A lot of people begin with those, but we've been going on this for Steam for over 10 years with the early access open world survivor games that never live up to the hype. It's probably something that for your own sanity, I would actually suggest not doing, because you can make those games. It's something that's really cool. Oh, I'm gonna make another apocalyptic open world zombie survival game or whatever. And it is something that people are gonna be interested in. But then you're looking at, okay, often these things have multiplayer. Do you have any experience with multiplayer? Do you know how to handle cost of multiplayer servers, setting up server infrastructure and whatever? Probably not that much. Also, once again, you have an extremely demanding audience, so you're probably developing multiple years on that same game, and it may not even be a game that you like. But you don't know that because these are one of the first genres, like the first games that you're making. Whilst you could technically make those games, I think generally you're better off trying to avoid them, especially as your first games, getting a bit more of a feel of, hey, how does Steam work? What do I know as a game developer? Before you take the plunge in those very large scale games. This leads me to another one, and that is just looking at like sort by top sellers on Steam, basically, like what are the most earning genres, because then you get things like 4X games, like for example a Stellaris or a Civilization or whatever. Even if you are a programmer, I strongly suggest you not to go into this, because most of you once again are solo developers as well. You are competing with too much of big boys basically, and the quality that your players will demand of you, we're not talking about 20 hours of replayability, we're talking about 200 hours minimum often. It's something that gets really hard to stand out in. Sure, you could try and make another space strategy, sci-fi game, whatever, 4X game, but once again, those are things that are going to take you multiple years of development time, and probably, you would learn more by going through that full start to finish release cycle on Steam in like half a year tops, versus immediately starting game dev and overcommitting on making the next Breath of the Wild or on making the next Stellaris or Civilization. So I hope this has given you some more ideas already. I know there's so many more genres I can talk about, like Survivor, like for example. We've made 3 tier lists at this point where I sit together with one of the other developers in our team and we talk about the pros and cons of like every single genre, basically, fighting games, city builder games, whatever. And we talk a bit more about, hey, should you make these, yes or no, and put them all on a neat little tier list. I think it's really good, interesting content if you wanna, get a bit more of an idea. But otherwise, I am very curious, if you have started development on your game, what was that first genre that you chose for? Leave a comment down below, and why do you think that it was a good idea, or looking back, was it an absolutely dumb idea? We started with an automation game. I think we had the good spirit, but I think we kind of bit off more than we could chew for that. So I'm very curious to hear about you as well. If you're new here, we're game developers, we make games and we talk about the things that we learn along the way working on those games. We upload 2 videos every week. So if that is something that you're interested in, learning about the things that we learned along the way, head down below and subscribe. It really helps us out and you'll get these videos delivered straight to your inbox, like I said, 2 times a week. That's all I had to say. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!